Chapter 9. The sky's coppery glare beat on the ranch buildings. On the homestead's wide veranda, Joan heard the iron roof creak, felt the hot waves of breeze swirling in from the ground. Through a tangled shade of leaves, hung tiredly on a vine, she watched Rick ride past. He had his hat tipped forward over his face. His hands rested on the pommel, close to the horse's swishing tail. Mick and Joe rode easily, a slouch in their saddles. Behind them, legs spread on a massive horse, Dawes jig-jogged uncomfortably. He was talking to Shawcross, mounted on a bay. Behind them again, a number of stockmen rode, stirrup to stirrup. They flowed past in a patter of hooves, trailing a stream of dust. Joan stared after them, thinking how picturesque they looked. The wide-brimmed hats, dusty-colored shirts, and prancing, curve-necked horses. She saw Rick twist round, saying something to Mick. Then Mick laughed as Rick's horse shied, kicking up dust. My goodness, she thought, he seems glued to the saddle, welded to it. He's more at home there than he was on one of my little chairs. A door opened near to her. She turned quickly when Miss Shawcross came through, closing it after her. "Hello there, Joan," she smiled. "The men have gone on down. If you're ready, we'll follow them." She pulled on a pair of gloves. "My husband's left the car over under the trees. It helps keep it cool," she added. Together they walked down the narrow wooden steps. Joan cupped her hand under the older woman's elbow. "You know, Miss Shawcross," she said, "this is all very wonderful. When I left Sydney, I never expected anything like this to happen. I still can't quite believe it." "Nonsense, my dear." Miss Shawcross's feet crunched firmly on the path. The little pebbles had been carted from a creek bed, 50 miles away. "I'm just as happy to have you here as you are to be here. Now, for goodness sake, stop talking about it." She bent over to unlatch the garden gate. Her tired eyes were questioning as she looked up at Joan. "How are you feeling now? In your heart, I mean, after that nasty business the other day?" Joan waited until the gate was latched, and they were walking towards the car. For a few moments she remembered Betty's face, the hard, glittering eyes, sun-slitted and raw. Saw the rifle barrel poked close to the windscreen. Then the sudden shock of Betty's agony, crawling in the dust. She flicked hair away from her face, brushed it with her hand. "I try not to think about it," she said. "At odd moments I suddenly feel a shudder. Otherwise, I'm not too bad. Last night was the worst. I couldn't sleep for thinking about it. The first night didn't seem to worry me. I suppose I was too tired." The car stood in dappled shade under a stringy tree. Miss Shawcross opened a door, slid him behind the wheel. Joan went to the other side. On the advice of Mr. Shawcross, she wore slacks. "If you want to get out of the car," he had said, "and have a close look at the cattle, you'd better wear trousers. Skirts'll scare the daylights out of 'em." Joan felt like a boy getting into the car. Her long legs looked strange next to Miss Shawcross's skirt. She quickly crossed them as the engine throbbed alive. Yes, Miss Shawcross said. You've been through a shocking experience and been very brave. We all admire you ever so much. She drove the car from the shade. They felt the fierce sun flare on the windscreen. In the distance, the horsemen had halted, grouped round a stockyard gate. Inside the heavy-railed fences, a big herd of cattle milled restlessly. Great columns of harsh red dust churned up to the brassy sky. As the car drew nearer, Joan saw Rick open the gate. He held it wide while the men rode past, then closed it again. For a moment he sat, his horse alone, fastening the gate. Then he was gone, merged with the other men, in a sea of long-horned cattle. Dust blotted them from view. Driving slowly between two trees, Miss Shawcross stopped the car. Straggly leaved limbs touched overhead. A clump of bushes sprouted in front of the bonnet. The 50 yards between car and stockyards stretched, dust hung and bare. There you are, Miss Shawcross smiled. That's as far as we can go. She nodded at the tree trunks, rough barked on either side. They don't give much shade, but they help to hide the car. Our cattle are not very gentle. In fact, they're almost wild. It doesn't take much to frighten them. Joan barely heard her. An angry wave of sound washed over and round the car. The dust-choked bullocks bellowed continuously. Their cloven hooves pounded the powdered ground. To unaccustomed ears, the noise was frightening. She listened, stunned into silence by the violent, bawling din. Miss Shawcross watched her face, guessed at the thoughts running through her mind. "It's all right, my dear," she said. "I know the noise sounds awful, and if you're not used to it, pretty frightening, but they're quite safe where they are. When the men let them out, they'll head down that way." She pointed with her hand towards a stark ridge of timber, merged on the skyline. "That's the first place to water, after the cattle leave the yards. Now that the drought is serious, there'll be no more water between there and Yorinda." A redoubled, angry bellowing boiled up from the stockyards. Red clouds of swirling dust darkened the sky and drifted over the car. Joan tied a scarf round her head. Miss Shawcross peered through the murk. "They've finished riding through them," she went on, "looking for hurt or crippled beasts. They're getting ready to count them out. If you want to go closer, you'd better run now, before they open the gates." She patted Joan's knee. Joan slowly opened the car door. Dust spiraled round her legs, choked in her face. Half blinded, she stared at Miss Shawcross. "I don't mind admitting," she said, and slammed the door after her, "that I feel a bit scared. What shall I do when I get there? Climb straight up on the fence?" Miss Shawcross laughed behind the windscreen. Her hands fumbled in her lap, twining her gloved fingers. She felt warmed by Joan's youngness, wanted to mother her. "Yes," she nodded, "just hurry as fast as you can. The men'll be looking for you. They'll see that you're all right." She stared after Joan, long-legging through the dust. Joan hopped the first few yards, then scuttled quickly. "My goodness," she thought, "I've not run like this for years. Not since I left school. I'm getting a stitch already." close to the stockyard fence. A press of wild horned heads rattled against the rails. Great slobbery nostrils bellowed in lowing surprise, then snorted away. Jones saw a horseman loom, knee close to the bullocks' rumps. It was Mr. Shawcross, waiting for her. His hand rubbed his dusty face as she panted up to the fence. "Ya only just made it," he grinned. "Another 10 seconds, and you'd have been caught in the rush. We held 'em back for ya." He watched Jones settle astraddle on the top. The hell, he thought. The hell we'd let them out. Not with you running around. He reined his horse sideways, breasting through the bullocks. "Just keep a tight hold," he called, over his shoulder. "The cattle might bump a bit. Jostle into the timber." He rode towards Rick, slit-eyed in the dust. Rick waited near the gate. Mick and Joe, with 3 stockmen, had the gate unchained, ready to ride outside, opposite Rick, across a 5-yard jam of cattle. Dawes sat his massive horse. Next to him, a lean-faced stockman trimmed a green-barked stick. Throughout the restless herd, other raw-eyed stockmen rode attentively, waiting for the counting. Shawcross reined in beside Rick. Harsh-throated, he spat at a bullock's tail. "Jones right," he nodded. "She's up on top of the fence. You can let 'em roll now." He nudged his horse with his spurs, easing it close to Rick's. For a few seconds Rick stared round the yards. Jones' hazy form, hand and leg clenched on the rail. Dawes on his big roan gelding. Mick at the gate. Everything's right, Rick thought, yet you never can tell. You open the bloody gate and start to count. The next thing you know is the bastards are gone, and you're flogging for the skyline. He jerked a thumbs up at Mick. "All right, Mick," he yelled. "You can see you arse down and opener. We're all set to count 'em." He choked as he finished shouting, spat a great ball of dust. Mick flicked his whip at the bullocks, swore at their slobbering heads. Horn close to his horse's tail. In a quick glance he checked Joe and the stockmen, all 4 abreast. Stirrup to leg-braced stirrup, hands low on their horses' necks, eyes slitted to dust-coated cracks. He bent over from the saddle, let the chain fall to the ground, flung the gates wide open. In line with Joe and the stockmen, he rode slowly forward. Behind him he heard the roar of hooves, the rattle of horns. Joe spurred to an urgent trot. The 3 stockmen cantered. Mick plunged to stay in line. The released flood of cattle surged through the gateway. The bullocks flowed swiftly, packed tight in a living stream, wither to jostling wither, neck to sweating neck, long-horned heads ripping at lean-gutted flanks, frantic hooves lashing at long-horned heads, dust thick on rolling backs, dust ringed round staring eyes, dust, dust, dust. Rick, Dawes, and Shawcross counted silently, rock fast in their saddles, forcing the cattle between them, holding the beast to a narrow stream. 3s, 5s, or 4s, whichever way they ran, the cattle were counted. Rick's eyes flickered redly. Dawes' hands twitched on the pommel. Shawcross's twined in the bridle. The arithmetic was mental, lightning in rapidity. The 100th bullock passed, flowed, coalesced with the next. Rick spat before he shouted, Dust throttled his grating voice. Dawes nodded in assent. "100 it is," he grunted. Shawcross lifted a hand. The lean-faced stockman reined his plunging horse. His narrow-bladed knife nicked a notch in the green-barked stick. Little curls of wood dribbled down on his trousers as he called out the tally. 1. Time passed with the flow of bullocks, passed in the blinding dust, spewed up to a glaring sun. Great bodies crushed through the gateway, great bodies pressed in the yards, and still they flowed. High on her jolting rail, Joan felt the smash of impact, looked down at the raw-boned bodies, rib-crushing on the fence. My goodness, she thought, as a wild-eyed head splintered a horn beneath her. They'll shake me off in a moment, throw me down on their straining backs, trample me under their hooves. She clung with redoubled effort, fear locked to the shuddering rail, thrilled by the violent splendor of the great cattle herd. Out on the hoof-churned plain, she saw Mick whirl in the dust, reef his horse round, iron-handed on the reins. In front of him, a stream of bullocks fought to break away. Mick flogged them back with his whip, cracking it on their hides. Beyond him again, half seen through the haze, Joe rode berserk with the stockmen. Headlong in wild-spurred gallop, they drove at a flying mass of bullocks, washed them round in waves, forcing them in towards the stockyards, holding them until all the cattle had flowed through the gateway. To Joan, the dust-murked world seemed full of cattle. Outside the stockyards, their galloping, crazy rumps dodged and twisted at all angles, trying to break for freedom, but always forced back by Mick, Joe, and the hard-riding stockmen. Inside the yards, packed tight round Rick and the other counters, they pressed towards the gateway. The frantic bawling maelstrom deadened the drums in her ears. Gradually the stockyards emptied. 2 more stockmen working inside the stockyards left the stragglers to their mates and rode out through the diminishing flow of the cattle. Dust reddened to raw-eyed mahogany, they plowed past Rick and Dawes, then settled down in their saddles, hats jerked low, spurs scraping on sweaty hide. They headed towards Mick, now almost lost to view, behind the mile-long stretch of cattle. Rick croaked a final 100. Shawcross raised his hand. Dawes grunted. 100 it is. Already gathering his reins, the lean-faced stockman notched his stick. 800 it is, he bellowed. 5s, 3s, 4s, the remainder pounded by. The last straggling bullock tail switched through the gate. Rick stared round the empty yards. 44 head, he grated, and 1 for the bloody boss. Dawes scratched his stubbled head. 45 head it is, he grunted. Shawcross raised his hand. The lean-faced stockman flung the stick at Rick and galloped out through the gateway. 845, he yelled back over his shoulder. Rick snatched the stick from the air. The remainder of Shawcross's stockmen thundered after the tally man. Dawes eased his behind in the saddle, wiped the sweat-streaked dust from his face. He reined over close to Rick, as Shawcross said, "There you are, Rick. 145 of the best. I hope you have a good trip with 'em." Dawes' massive horse lowered its head to rub its dust-filled eyes on Rick's trousers leg. Rick pushed it away with his boot. The hell, he thought, the bastard's using a man as a sweat rag, wiping his running eyes on a man's leg. He nudged his horse away, facing it head-on to Dawes. "God damn it," he grinned. "You want to hold his bloody head up. He's buggered up my trousers. Spoilt the creases in 'em." He looked down at his legs, rammed tight in the stirrups. Dust thickly coated the trousers. Horse sweat stained their reddish tinge. Dawes winked a bloodshot eye. "You want to mind your language," he chuckled. "We've got company." He winked the eye at Shawcross. "That's the trouble with this dust. You can't hear people when they sneak up behind you." Shawcross smiled down at Joan. He had been watching her walk across the yards. Dust smothered every inch of her scarf-covered hair. 2 shoe-clad feet. She had wiped her mouth clean, showing 2 white strips round her lips' redness. "How are you there, Joan?" he said. "How did you like it? What did you think of our cattle counting? Tallying, as we call it." Rick swiveled in his saddle. "For crying out loud," he said. "I forgot you was there." His hand rubbed on his chin. "There's one thing about it, Joan. Whenever you're around, I always seem to be swearing, using some pretty ripe language. You must be getting used to it." Joan nodded her dusty head. "Don't worry," she smiled. "I told you I would, and I am. In fact, I've been using some myself, especially when I nearly fell off that rail. I thought it was wonderful," she added, looking up at Shawcross. "I'm glad I saw it, but I can't for the life of me understand why some of you don't get killed. The cattle are so wild, horning each other all the time. It's a wonder they don't horn you too." Shawcross patted the maned neck under his bridle hand. "They would," he said, "if we didn't have these fellers. When a man's on a horse, the cattle respect him. When he's on his own 2 feet, the coots would just as soon knock him down, poke a horn in his ribs." He stared at the great herd milling on the plain. The stockman had it steadied, circling in a huge cartwheel. "That's the way it goes, and if it wasn't, we'd never handle 'em. The first thing a cattleman has to be is a horseman, and a top one at that." Far on the plain's dusty surface, Joe rode clear of the herd. For a few signaling moments, his hat arced above his head. Then he rode back to the bullocks, disappeared behind them. Rick gathered the reins in his hand. "Well," he nodded, "there's Joe waving his hat, which means, roughly translated, what the hell am I doing? Why don't I get out of there and give him a hand? Get the cattle moving." He looked down at Joan, then at Dawes, and Shawcross. "So long, everybody. I'll be seeing ya when I see ya." "So long," they said, and watched him, hip lean above the saddle, ride out through the gateway. His wide shoulders were rigid, balanced to the rhythm. Without looking back, he spurred his horse to a gallop. A tired drift of dust beat up from the pounding hooves. Dawes scratched his stubbled head. Shawcross laughed down at Joan. "That's Rick all over," he chuckled. "Never waste time on talking. If he says good day or so long, it's a big effort. You're lucky if he speaks for another hour or more. He reined his horse round. Come on, Jim. We'll get home to the ranch house. There's a few papers we'll have to fix up. See you later, Joan. When you've finished watching the cattle, the wife'll drive over for ya. I can see her backing out now. He rode through the gateway, with Dawes following him. So long, Joan, Dawes added. Don't stay too long in the sun. It can knock you pretty quick. You've had about enough for one day. Joan shifted the scarf on her head, shading it over her eyes. Sun and dust had made them raw. She could feel the grit grating under her eyelids. I won't, she said. I'm too dirty to stay for long. When I have a shower, it will be the best one I've ever had. She waved her hand as the two men rode away, laughing. It will at that, Dawes called, leaning her arms on a gate rail. Joan watched Rick's galloping form. Distance, dust, and sun glare merged horse and rider into one. They looked toy-like against plain and sky immensity. Dust smothered them when they reached the herd. It's strange, Joan thought. Although he's hard and tough, there's something gentle about him. Sad almost, as if he'd like to be different. Lead a different life. Yet he couldn't. He's as much part of the back country as the mirages dancing on the horizon. Joan rubbed a hand across her eyes. They stung from the biting dust. Perhaps he was a mirage, a mental mirage. Someone round whom she built. Unreal imaginings. She was startled when the car slid in front of her, braking to a halt near the gate. You were miles away, Miss Shawcross smiled. She leaned across the seat and unlatched the door. Whereabouts were you? Somewhere on Sydney's golden beaches or tumbling in the surf. I should think it would be heavenly compared to this. Her tired blue eyes flickered away from Joan, stared through the window at the heat-glazed sky, the wide columns of dust drifting up from the herd. Joan walked towards the car. She had settled on the seat and closed the door when she said, No, nothing could be farther from my mind. I was thinking about the people here, the lives they lead, Rick in particular. I've only met him 2 or 3 times, but I think he's a very fine man. Faintly, a harsh drone of sound rolled back from the distant herd. The bawling cattle were flowing slowly, ringed by indistinct riders. Lonely against the skyline, a horseman rode in the lead, guiding the widespread herd, steering it towards the watering point, stark timbered on the horizon. That will be Rick, Miss Shawcross thought, out where the boss drover should be, guiding and steadying his cattle. For the next few months he will live cattle, think cattle, and eat cattle. There is no place in his life for a girl, least of all a girl like Joan. She patted Joan's hand. Yes, she nodded, he is a fine man. As we say, in the back country, they don't come any better. If it's possible to get him, my husband won't let any other drover take his cattle on the road. The trouble is, many more of the ranch owners feel the same way. You must understand, Joan, Rick's life and the men's with him is different to most. Even a sailor can come home from the sea, but Rick has no home. Only the sky, pack saddles, and the big mob of horses he owns. You can't keep 60 to 80 horses in a backyard, she added. He has to live where the grass and water is. Joan felt the kindness in the older woman's voice, sensed the understanding in it. I know, she said. The few weeks I've lived out here has taught me much about a way of life I hardly knew existed. But where Rick's concerned, I can't help feeling he's not really happy. She repeated her thoughts. He would like to lead a different life. Miss Shawcross pulled her gloves tight, settled the faded straw hat more firmly on her head. That's a fairly common attribute, she chuckled, with many people in the back country. Most of us hate the place most of the time, but we never leave it. Those who do always come back, or want to come back. No, my dear. She switched the ignition, started the engine. Power throbbed through the car. Rick wouldn't change his work for any other. You can rest assured of that. Cattle drovers are a race apart, even from cattlemen, who work properties like this one. Look at them now, she pointed with her hand. Her tired face suddenly grew youthful, vibrant with expression. Could you see any picture more splendid, so magnificent in its vastness? That's what holds Rick here, Joan. That's what holds us all. You may be surprised, but my husband and I have traveled round the world. We've visited great American cattle ranches, seen the great sweeps of desert throughout the Middle East, and nowhere gave us the feeling of immensity such as you find here in the Australian outback. She laughed when she finished speaking. Her hand closed over the great lever. Her foot pressed down on the clutch. I'm getting carried away, she added. Must be trying to sell you the country. The car swung round slowly. Heat poured on the dusty metal, beat in through the open windows. Joan stretched her legs, making her hot body comfortable. She could feel the sweaty dust chafe inside her shirt, feel it thick in her shoes and on her ankles. You don't have to do that, she smiled ruefully. I've already bought half of it, or at least so it seems, and most of it's with me, inside my shirt, and mussed up in my hair. She settled contentedly, staring ahead through the windscreen, at the nearing homestead. But seriously, though, what you've said about the country explains my own feelings. Despite the heat, dust, and flies, I've grown to love every sun-cracked part of it, and I don't want to leave it, unless I'm forced to. In regard to Rick, I couldn't possibly argue. You know him far better than I do. It was just a thought I had, an impression he gave me. Miss Shawcross changed a gear. The car bumped over a dry gully, crawled up the far side, before reaching level again. There's another heartbreak, she thought, in store for her. She can survive Bede and his vicious nightmare. She can even survive the climate, which breaks most women's hearts, mine included. But she won't survive Rick. If she falls in love with him, there is no way out. Rick's life and hers can't meet. A gulf wide as an ocean separates them. She changed the gear again. The car sped towards the homestead. I wouldn't think too much about him if I were you, she said. Once he passes through Yorinda with the cattle, you won't see him for months. Perhaps not then. You yourself may have left for Sydney. It's not always easy to tell just how things will turn out. Joan guessed at the older woman's thoughts, guessed at the advice she wanted to give. "I don't think about him much," she lied, "except when I see him, such as a short time ago, when he was counting the cattle. You could call it a sort of mercenary interest, if you like. He's one of my customers, you know. He and his 2 friends have been in for several meals. They've been more than kind, terribly generous, in fact." She remembered the money tucked underneath a plate. Miss Shawcross slowed the car, braked it to a stop under the stringy tree. A strip of dappled shade fell lightly on the bonnet. Across the dusty grassless square, the weathered homestead sprawled, iron-roofed in the glare. Shadows darkened the vine-hung verandas. "They would be," Miss Shawcross nodded. "That's the kind of men they are. Rough, sweaty, and foul-mouthed, if you call it foul-mouthed, but real men. Gentle, really, under their toughness." She smiled and slid her feet out of the car. "I should know. I've known them all long enough." Hooves thudded behind the homestead. Dust eddied up over the hot iron rooftop. Round the building's sun-bleached corner, a shaggy-maned horse trotted into view. Tail close to it came another, and another, until finally a big mob strung across the square. Joan hurried out of the car to watch, stood beside Miss Shawcross. Sweat-caked and saddle-scarred, the horses trotted by, tangled mane to streaming tail, rib to flank-jostling rib. They pounded in the dust. A dozen had piled-high pack-saddles lashed down on their backs. One had galvanized water tanks tight-girthed to its jolting withers. Another had great hunks of meat, covered with blood-blackened claws, strapped to its bloodied saddle. Every horse had a pair of green-hide hobbles, chain-linked to its shaggy neck. From the unshod, scuffling hooves, dust kicked up to the muscled bellies, settled on sweaty backs. In the trailing smother, a horseman jig-jogged slowly, close to the watching women. He half raised one hand. Joan noticed 2 fingers were missing. A stub twitched in place of a thumb. "Good day there, missus." He nodded. "And you too, miss. She ain't much of a place to be. There's more ground in the air than there is underfoot." He jerked the hand down, hooked the thumb stub in his belt. His hard, wrinkled face was expressionless as he stared from Joan to Miss Shawcross. The lean gut of his body swayed to the saddle's movement. Miss Shawcross pulled off her gloves, tucking them under her arm. "Good day there, Harry," she smiled. "You're right about the dust. I often wonder that we have any land left." She spoke to Harry's flat-shouldered back when she added, "The horses look well. How many have you got there?" Harry screwed round in the saddle. 65, missus," he said, "and 5 they're riding. Ol' Rick's well horsed up. If the weather'd only break and give us a bit of grass, they'd do all right. Get a bit of grease on their ribs." He straightened and spat over the pommel. Miss Shawcross and Joan watched him spur forward, ride close to a big-limbed pack-horse, nibbling at a shrub. "Get up there, you bastard," they heard him say. "Get up there with ya mates, or I'll flog the hide off ya. We ain't got all flamin' day." The big horse snorted after the mob. Harry jig-jogged behind it, laughing together. Miss Shawcross and Joan walked through the dust. It smelt bitter with the tang of horse sweat, rank with the reek of droppings, scattered across the square. Inside the garden gate, Joan paused to shade her eyes. Clear of the ranch buildings, the horses were strung out in files, grazing on the sparse grass. A slouch in the saddle, hat tipped over his eyes, Harry urged them in the direction of the great cattle herd, rolling slowly towards the gaunt-timbered watering point. Joan squinted against the sun glare. "He seemed a strange kind of man," she said. "What would you call him? I mean, what is his job supposed to be?" "He's the horse tailor." Miss Shawcross stood beside Joan, let her gloves rest on the gate. "And in his way, he is a strange character, very moody. I believe he drinks heavily at times. He's been working for my husband. Now he's going with Rick. I'm not sure, but I think he's combining the job of cook with horse tailing. Did you notice his hand?" Joan wriggled uncomfortably. Sweat itched between her shoulder blades, trickled down her back. "Yes, I did," she nodded. "He must have had a dreadful accident. There's only 2 fingers left, and a stump of a thumb." She lifted the shirt away from her breast, felt the air flow in on her body. "How did it happen? Have you any idea?" Miss Shawcross touched Joan's arm, and they walked along the path to the crunching of their feet. The older woman said, "Yes, but it's not very pleasant. I don't think I'd better tell you. You might be too upset. It always makes me feel sick if I happen to think about it." In the shadowed veranda coolness, Joan flopped on a chair. Phew, she thought, looking down at her long, dusty legs. Another half-hour out there in the sun, and I'd have been roasted, baked to a dry brown cinder. She untied the scarf from her head, shook her dusty hair. "I would like to know if you would tell me." She said, "It may sound silly to you, but I'm always trying to piece together the different angles of this backcountry life, learn about the people. After all, I am trying to make my home out here." Trying to make a home is right, Miss Shawcross thought. For people like myself, with a large home and plenty of money, it's not too difficult. For a young girl struggling to make a small business pay, the chances are remote, especially if she falls in love with a wandering cattle drover. Miss Shawcross tossed her gloves on a wicker cane settee, then sat gratefully beside them. The heat made her tired, had done for years. "All right, my dear," she smiled. "I don't suppose it is all that terrible. The story of one drunken drover's cook is neither here nor there. You'll probably hear many worse. In fact, you already have. That trouble with Bette Dennis is far more terrible." She unpinned the straw hat and set it on her lap. Dust powdered thick on the straw's tight mesh. Two-fingered Harry, as he's called, has been in these parts for a long time, longer than I can remember, but I can remember when he cut off his fingers. It must be about 20 years ago. Joan slid lower in her chair. Her clothes felt hot, sweaty hot, stuck close to her skin. She fanned her face with the scarf. As Dawes came through a doorway, the dry floorboards creaked when he bulged down on a seat. "So, you got back," he grunted. I was beginning to think you was lost, bushed in the flamin' dust." He glanced from Joan to the older woman. "Hope I'm not intruding, but I heard you talkin' and thought I'd come out for a bit of feminine company. The old man in there," he jerked a thumb, "can only talk about bullocks, and I've had enough of 'em for one day. Got the smell of 'em still in me nose." He shoved a hand in his straining pocket, fumbling for a handkerchief. Joan smiled when he wiped his sweating neck folds. "What's the matter?" he chuckled. "Do I look all that funny, or can you smell the bullocks too?" "No." Joan flushed under her dust when she said it. Laughter glowed in her sun-sore eyes. "But I could see you on that horse this morning. It's something I never expected. You know," she added lamely, "you don't look quite suited, not the way Rick and the others do." Dawes shifted his great bulk sideways. "The hell," he thought, "so there it is. A man can rope his tent and lash it down on the pack saddle, fold up his dreams, and ride away, the tracks stretching out, lonelier than ever." He slapped a hand on his thigh, felt the great swaths of fat solid under his fingers. "You're right about there, Joan," he grunted. "You're just about dead right. A man needs a block and tackle to get him into the saddle, and a damn great cart horse to carry him." Miss Shawcross quickly sensed his mood. Her tired eyes flickered, glancing from him to Joan. "We were talking about Harry," she said to Dawes. "Joan asked me about his hand, how he came to have 2 fingers and part of his thumb cut off. I told her it was a pretty gruesome story. Perhaps you would like to tell her, while I go and get the showers ready. See that there's plenty of soap and towels." She stood up, gathering the gloves with her hat. "Sure." Dawes sprawled back in his seat. He waited till Miss Shawcross left, heels tapping along the veranda, through a curtained doorway. "The way it is," he thought, "a man can tell a yarn. Over the days, perhaps months, he can tell her many yarns, and it helps to keep her near him. But he can't carve away the fat, or crush her soft youngness tight in his arms." He crossed his arms slowly, resting them on his paunch. "Old Harry's a character," he said, "whose main thought in life is to get sodden, rotten drunk. If he can be kept away from the towns or supplies of grog when he's working, he's all right. If he can't, he's a living, howling terror. They don't come any worse. He'll rip and smash until he's flattened, belted on the head, or tied to a tree. I saw him once frothing at the mouth, spread-eagled on a wagon wheel. They'd strapped him there to save him from killing himself. He'd tried to cut his throat with the lid of a rusty jam tin." "Good God!" Joan slid upright in her chair. She brushed the hair from her face. "Why do people employ him then? Isn't he dangerous to have around?" Dawes fumbled for his handkerchief, wiped his sweaty neck folds. "Yeah," he nodded, "he's dangerous all right. But you know, Joan, the one thing about the back country, we always give a man a chance. If someone didn't give him a job," he shrugged his heavy shoulders, "what would happen to him? As I've said, he's a decent joker when he's sober, and as we see it, you've got to take the rough with the smooth. So there's always someone ready to give him, or any other misfit for that matter, a job. But to get back to his hand and how he came to lose his fingers." Dawes crossed his arms again, settled them on his belly. About 20 years ago, Harry and a mate were working on a fencing contract. They had 30 miles of barbed wire to put up for a neighbor of Shawcross's on the other side of those sandhills we came across the other day. In those times, Harry was a bit different to what he is now, rough, tough, and don't give a damn, but a fine type of man, and a good worker. Anyway, Dawes cleared his throat, spraddling his legs wider. After Harry and his mate had worked a month or two on the contract, a traveling Afghan storekeeper dropped by in his wagonette. We used to have a lot of 'em in this part of the world, still have a few in fact. They sell anything from women's dresses to tinned pork and beans. Most of 'em are decent enough, but this one was a bit crook. He had a few cases of wine hidden under his goods. Illegal, of course, as they're not licensed. To cut it short, Harry and his mate bought a whole case, just 24 bottles. Then, when the wagonette was just a speck in the distance, they settled down to drink the grog, under a stinking sun. Wine is murderous. Dawes wiped his streaming face. Joan leaned forward in her chair, the itching sweat forgotten. Towards late afternoon, Dawes went on. The pair of 'em were dancing mad in the dust, kicking a crazy caper, with only the brazen sky to watch them. Then Harry tripped over a log and fell in the fire. Dawes paused for breath. That's when he lost his fingers. Joan shuddered icily. Good heavens, she gasped. He had them burnt off. It must have been ghastly. Dawes shook his stubbled head. No, he said, they weren't burned off, but cut. Harry staggered up from the fire and stared at his sizzling fingers. Before his mate could move, he knelt down by the log, spreading the two red-hot fingers, and thumb top in line, he hacked them off and tossed them into the fire. That'll fix the bastards, his mate heard him say. They won't turn gangrenous on a man. Dawes jerked quickly out of his seat. Joan swayed, woodenly reaching in front of her. Dawes grasped her hands and helped her to her feet. "The hell," he grunted. "I told it to you rough. Didn't think of what I was saying." The curtain swished in the doorway. Miss Shawcross halted, then hurried to take Joan's arm. Dawes clung to the other one. "It's all my fault," he said. "The way I told it. It was a lousy yarn to tell her. A man ought to be out with the bullocks, getting flogged on the bloody rump." His hand scrubbed at his head. The eyes in his heavy pouched lids glistened brightly. Miss Shawcross pushed him away. Her glance scanned his face, then Joan's tousled head. That's the way men are, she thought, tough in the way they live, but soft under it all. A girl feels faint, and they crumble. They think she's going to die. She gently pressed Joan's arm. "Come along, Joan," she said. "The shower's all ready. You'll soon be as right as rain, when you've bathed and changed. I'll make you a nice cup of tea." Chapter 10. Mick eased his boot from the stirrup, swung crutch-stiff from the saddle, bow-legged on the ground. He hooked the reins on his arm. The hell, he thought, it's all right there on the sweat pads when a man's got a horse between his legs, but no damned good when he ain't. The ache in his groins stiffens him. He rocked past the campfire. Dull glowed in the darkness. Close to a blanket-covered form, he prodded with his boot toe. "Hey, there, Rick," he grunted. Get up out of it, or y'all sleep yourself to death. The bullocks are camped peaceful, and it wants an hour to daylight." Rick shoved away the blankets. One hand reached for his hat. The other smoothed his hair. "God damn it," he said. "It was good while it lasted. What time did you say it was?" He sat up, hat on head, to pull on his boots. Mick led his horse into the darkness, came back with another one, held short by the bridle reins. "About an hour to daylight. Ya needn't bust your gut. Joe's out there singin' his head off, and the bullocks are right. There's not a sniff out of 'em. They're flat on the ground, chewin' their cud." He passed the reins to Rick. The ashes and the fire tumbled. A shower of sparks glittered close to the horse's heels. It snorted gently, worried by the flames. Rick patted a hand on its nose. "She's right, boy," he said, and levered up into the saddle. "You could do with a tail singe. Well, so long, Mick. You got time for a bit of shut-eye. We'll have breakfast at daylight, and move 'em when we're through." He nudged the horse with his spurs. Darkness closed in behind him. Mick listened to the hoofbeats padding in the dust. "Yeah," he grunted, "a bit of shut-eye is right. She don't take long to go." Stiff-legged, he stretched out on his blankets. "The old saddle basher," he thought. "He's up and gone before you can spit. They don't come any better." Sleep lidded his dust-sore eyes. Close to the shadowy cattle mass, Rick tipped back his hat. On the far side of the herd, Joe rode his lonely vigil. Rick heard his mournful voice, whispering in the stillness, against the great distant sky. The voice sounded tiny, lost in remoteness. "It's a big world, all right," Rick thought, "and sometimes it hits ya. The sky seems to stretch forever, smothered in clouds of stars. A man would know all the answers, if he knew what was up there on 'em." He shrugged his wide-set shoulders. The night chill bit through his shirt. What did it matter so long as the bullocks were quiet? A man kicks his 10 for the time it takes. When the 10 rolls away, he's done. Bullocks or horses, women or men, they all finish up in the dust. Rick spat over the swaying pommel. The hell, he was getting morbid. Often did on the last lonely watch ride. Thoughts come and go in a man. Maybe it was the thin pallor of dawn that did it, or maybe it was the songs. Joe was out there now, singing about his mother, buried in the churchyard, roses twined all over her. The same song every drover sang. For crying out loud! Rick jerked the hat forward. Joe can't remember his mother. She died in a bushfire anyway. Rick looped the reins in his hand, head bent to a chuckle. He rode through the lifting darkness. Along the widespread herd face, bullocks grunted on the ground. Little sighs belched their muscled jaws. Cud slobber drooled from their lips. Rick smelt the bitter sourness, rank in the dawn-chilled air. They ain't got much in 'em, he thought, but they're making the most of it. She was a dry track yesterday, and going to be a damned sight drier today. Very little grass and no water until the evening, when we hit the river, above Yorinda. With a bit of luck, we should have 'em over the bridge, and tucked in the yards by sundown. Then a man can have a decent sleep. The only one for the next 2 months. He tipped his hat again. He'd better start singing, or the bastards be getting cranky. Some of 'em were snorting. The hell of it is, a man's got a voice like a bullfrog, but the bullocks ain't judges of opera. He'd sing 'em that one about the stockman buried under a coolabah tree. That ought to keep 'em quiet. Rick opened his lean-jawed mouth, crooned through half-shut teeth, "Oh, wrap me up with my stock whip and blankets, and bury me deep down below." The bullocks stopped their snorting, and settled down on the ground. Rick nudged his horse with his spurs. Gradually, the dawn's light lit the horizon. Gray half-tones crept through the herd. The great angular beasts shook their long-horned heads, stretched their ground-cramped limbs. On his blankets near the fire, Mick stared slit-eyed at Harry. The cook was bent over the ashes, poking little sticks round the billy. Red-tongued flames licked at its blackness. Mick heard the sound of horses whinnying on the plain. So there it is, he thought. A man's had his little bit of shut-eye, and it only seems like a minute. Who the hell would be a drover? He yawned as he pulled on his boots. Harry squinted over the fire smoke. Mick looked haggard, with 2 days' growth of whiskers. "You got time for a shave, Mick," he said, "if you want to scrape 'em off. We'll be hitting the big town tonight, and you might feel like some grog. She don't taste too good when you strain her through your whiskers." He winked a sun-creased eye. Mick's big hand felt for his chin, grated on the stubble. "You can wipe that from your mind," he grunted. "We don't drink in this outfit when we're on the roads with cattle. Rick, Joe, and me made a deal a long time ago. We'll rip it up while we're empty, when there's only ourselves and the nags to worry about, but not when we're roadin' cattle. And that goes for everyone." He straightened up from his blankets. Harry watched him stamp his feet, fitting them to the boot's tightness. "That may be how she goes for you fellers," Harry said, "but she don't go that way for me. The man ain't foaled that can put a stopper in me trap. If a man wants to sink a schooner—" He spat in the ashes. The two-fingered hand wiped his mouth. "They ain't no law to stop 'em." Mick stared at the horses trotting in towards the camp. Dust blurred them in the half-light. Larry Sells, one of the men from Shawcross, was driving them. Mick saw a big gelding plunge viciously. "The bastard," he thought. "That's the cross-eyed cow that kicked me. I've still got the bruise there." His fingers prodded his belly. "Maybe they ain't," he nodded. "And there again, maybe they is. But if you think they ain't," he unbuckled his belt and tucked in his shirt. "Just try it. She's a bloody tough life when you ain't got a job." Water spluttered in the billy, hissing up steam from the sticks. Harry reached for a T10, rolled tight in his blankets. The other stockman from Shawcross snored. Mick flung a pair of hobbles. They hit the man's rump, jolting him upright. Straight-legged in his blankets. "The hell," he yawned. "What time is it? A man ain't had enough. The sleep's still crawlin' in him." Mick hefted a saddle and bridle. He had the saddle on his shoulder when he said, "It depends on how you look at it, Clem. Right now there's a mob of jittery horses and a herd of hungry bullocks, waitin' to get started. Get up and get your swag rolled. The sunrise "'Ull bugger ya eyes." He heel-rocked towards the horses, now whinnying near the camp. Close to them he dumped the saddle on the ground. Sure-eyed amongst the jostling, dusty animals, he searched for the horse he wanted, a hammer-nosed gelding with 2 white hind feet. "He'll do me," he thought, "if we crack some hard riding. The bullocks might scarp a bit when we're getting near water." He slid a hand on the horse's wither, slipped the bridle over its head. "Come on, son," he said, "and don't throw the rigging. You want to save your strength. It's a long day between now and sundown." He led the horse towards his saddle. Hard-faced in the dust, he girthed the leather tight, settling it down on the gelding's back. The buckle strained to its last notched hole, and the horse jerked away. Mick felt the bridle reins cut into his calloused hands, felt the power of the bucking horse pulling on his arms. "For crying out loud," he grunted, "I told you to save it. Thee's a long way to go today." He caught the horse by its ear, pulled its head down between its legs. It stood trembling, held by the iron grip. Larry Sells came jogging round, the horse heard, leg cocked on his saddle's pommel. He rolled a cigarette. He had a match cupped in his hands when he said, "Good day there, Mick. You're having some trouble. The nag's got an itchy back." He lit the cigarette. Smoke puffed out through his hands. The horse strained again on its ear, pulling backwards until its haunches scraped on the ground. Mick kept the ear held firm. Sweat made his palm feel slippery. "Havin' troubles right," he grunted. "You can't beat 'em, can ya? A man does his best tryin' to help the coot, and this is how he repays 'em." He prodded the horse with his boot, towing it in the ribs. The animal snorted upright. "It's the way things go," Larry nodded. "They're like women. The better you treat 'em, the more they knock you around." Mick's stubbled face creased. "What the hell are you trying to give me?" he chuckled. "You wouldn't know which end of a woman to kiss, neither learn how to treat 'em." "I wouldn't say that," Larry grunted. Smoke trickled through his lips. "I've had a couple in me time." Mick eased his grip from the ear, rubbed the horse between the eyes. "Maybe you have," he nodded. "But they was spread over a long time. By the time you had the second one, you'd forgotten all about it. Had to learn all over again." He walked away chuckling. The horse jogged after him, kicking up its heels. Mick looked round over his shoulder. "Even the bloody horses tickled," he added. The cigarette bobbed. Larry tongued it across his lips as he straightened his leg in the saddle. He grinned down at Mick. "Yeah," he said, "but it ain't about the women. The bastard knows he's goin' to throw ya." Mick scuffed his heels in the dust. "Not on your life," Larry heard him say. "I could ride the crowbait blindfold." Bridle reins hooked on arm, Mick squatted by the fire. Harry passed him a plate and a mug of steaming tea. "Ya was having a mug out there," Harry said. "Thought you was in a hurry. Wanted to get the cattle moving." "Well, get 'em moving." Mick forked cold meat onto the plate, broke off a piece of damper. "When I want you to keep an eye on what I'm doin', I'll let you know." The sun speared red against the dawn sky. Purple-shadowed haze darkened the vast plain's rim. 400 yards from the camp site, The great herd woke to life, began a restless bawling. Dust swirled from their fidgety hooves. Round their mass of gaunt-ribbed bodies, Rick and Joe rode endlessly, crooning their sad-toned songs. The way it is, Mick thought, staring towards the cattle, anything can happen. They can bolt when they sniff the water, or rip out their guts if they get a scare. And even if they don't, the day's going to be lively. 2 days without water is too long for fresh cattle. It's all right if their road broke, been on the track for months. Then they're more or less used to it, but when they're not, like this mob, the maggots crawl in their brains. He chewed a last mouthful of meat, then washed it down with tea. Across the dull cold ashes, Clem tossed away his mug, buckled a pair of spurs to his boots. "I'll get out to Larry," he said, "and let him come in for some scran. What horse do you want me to take?" Mick glanced at Clem's behind, upended over a saddle. The trousers were stiff, caked on the legs with horse sweat, polished on the seat with leather oil. The hell, Mick thought, there's more oil on his arse than there is on the saddle. It's the heat that does it, draws it out of the leather. He straightened his own squatting, cramped legs. "The bald-faced bay'll do ya," he nodded. "He's good when he settles down. Just take it easy with your girth. Don't screw it down too quick." Clem shouldered the saddle towards the horse herd, trailing the bridle in the dust. The gelding suddenly snorted. Mick heard Harry swear as he dodged a flailing hoof. "For tryin' to jump sideways," the cook grunted. "Why don't you take 'em out of it? A man'll get his leg broke with the damn thing dancing round." "So long as it ain't your neck," Mick chuckled. "You don't want to worry. You can put a splint on your leg, but she's tough when it comes to your neck." Hand gripped to the gelding's mane, he swung into the saddle. For swearing, straining seconds, the gelding smashed round the campfire. Its hooves scattered through the ashes and trampled on the blankets, flattened a row of pack saddles. Harry dodged from buck to buck, cursing every side twist, ashes mixed with the dust, kicking up in his face. Then Mick reefed on the bridle. Reins hauled the hammerhead out from between the gelding's legs. "So long, Harry," he chuckled. "I'll be seeing ya. Get the gear packed soon as everyone's eaten." Tight-seated in the saddle, he rode towards the cattle, bawling in the distance. Behind him, Harry cursed all crazy bushmen. "The bastard's mad," he said, when Larry rode in from the horse herd. "Mad as a cork in a bottle. Look what he's done to the place. A man ought to belt him one, fair over his wooden skull." Larry's length of dusty leg swung over his horse's rump. His boot soles creaked as he squatted near the billy. "I wouldn't say that," he grunted. "You'd need to be born lucky. The cow can fight like a mule, come at you from all angles." He reached for a tipped-over pannikin, half buried in the ashes. "The hell he can!" Harry's two-fingered hand dusted a plate. He set meat and damper on it. "I'll take him any time, fingers or no bloody fingers." His hard face puckered, squinting down at Larry. Larry tipped tea into the pannikin. Scum floated in the brownness. He scooped it off with a spoon. The old saddle tramp, he thought. The bastard stinks of trouble. Looks for it all the time. A man ought to kick in his teeth. Old Rick's gonna be sorry he ever gave him a job. He stared at the sun tip, red scarred on the skyline. You'd want all your fingers and another set besides, he grunted. Now pass me so-called breakfast. Mick's taking over from Joe, and I'm doing the same for Rick. The cattle's got to be moving before that sun's much higher. He took the plate from Harry and set it on the ground. Time passed with the changing of watches. Each man wolfed a meal, hunkered near the ashes, slouch-footed on the ground. They changed horses, leaving two-fingered Harry and Clem to load the pack saddles. When the sun's fierce ball climbed crimson above the skyline, Rick gave the sign to move. Let 'em roll, he said to Mick, a jostle at his stirrup. I'll ride out in the lead. You keep 'em stringin' steady, and don't pile 'em up behind me. He nudged his horse away, riding close to the tail-switching rumps. Mick twisted in the saddle, lean-ribbed on empty paunches. The bullocks bawled sullenly. High above the roar, Mick bellowed to Joe and Larry, his big hand arced in a semicircle. Close to the herd's far rim, Joe saw the signal, waved his hat in reply. The hell, he thought, and about goddamn time. A man's getting sunstroke trying to hold 'em. They're ripping, snorting mad, busting to get to water. They'll all belt straight to hell when they smell it. He settled his boots in the stirrups, jerked his hat down low over his eyes. In the drifting dust behind him, he heard the whisper of Larry's voice, swearing at the cattle. The bullocks bawled into movement, flowing wild-horned from the night camp, leaving it dung-piled, bitter with urine. Through the haze of trampled dust, their gaunt bodies quickened, flowed streaming across the plain. Near to Rick's jog-footed horse, the leaders balked abruptly, splayed, wide-hooved in the dust. Rick swung his long-thonged whip. "Get back there," he grunted, "and take it easy. There's a long way to go yet." He squinted over the bone-ridged backs. They say there's 1 in 1,000, he thought, who can spit through the eye of a needle. But our chances of stopping these bullocks would be a damned sight less. If they take it into their minds, we'll all go flog into hell. Wouldn't have a Buckley's for stopping them. He spat over the pommel. In the trailing dust cloud smother, Mick had the same stark thoughts. Slit-eyed, under down-pulled brim, he rode alone in the rear, urging on the stragglers, wild, snorting beasts, keen-witted to break away. An hour after leaving the night camp, Clem cantered across from the horse herd, pack-saddled and traveling in the distance. Hard-handed on the reins, he jerked to a halt beside Mick. "How's she going there?" He nodded. "I've just left Harry with the nags. They're jogging along right. He wants to know what you want 'em to do. Push on ahead and make a dinner camp, or keep 'em where he is, a half-mile and behind." Mick flicked his whip at a bullock. "No," he said. "Me and Rick decided we wouldn't make dinner camp. Keep 'em rolling right through the day. Get back and tell him to swing 'em wide of the mob and take 'em to Yorinda. He can feed 'em along till about 3 o'clock, then put 'em over the bridge into the yards. When they're right, he can canter out smart and give us a hand to water the hornies." He jerked a thumb at the cattle. "We're going to need all the help there is." Clem scratched his doubtful chin. His whip flipped a bullock's rump when he said, "Do you think he's safe? I mean, you know what he's like. The bastard drinks like a sieve. He might take a jaunt into town." Mick peered towards the horses, half shimmered by mirage. Their shapes looked twisted, cut off at the knees. False heat-glazed water flooded round them. "No," he grunted, "he ain't that low. The man don't live who'd do it. Just tell him what I said, and he'll be right. And when you come back, pull him behind Rick, out on the wing a bit. The front's where the trouble's going to be." The tense hours crawled in the sun glare. Strain-faced in the lead, Rick saw Dawes' car bumping towards him. Near to a withered bark-bare stump, it rocked to a stop. He watched Dawes' bulky form bulge into the open, then lean against a mudguard. The massive spread of shirt gleamed white in the sunlight. Now what the hell, Rick thought, does he want? Some way or other it spells trouble. He ought either to be still out at Shawcross, or else in Yorinda, polishing a chair. But there's one thing about him. He's done the right thing. Stopped the car in just the right place, a good half-mile away. Rick waved a hand to Joe, slouched, leg bowed in his saddle. Joe woke to instant life, jammed his boots home in the stirrups, spurred close to Rick's. His horse plunged violently over its rearing withers. He heard Rick yell, "Take over here while I see what Jim wants." Then the voice cut short. Rick was pounding towards the car, close to the dusty bonnet. Rick haunched the horse down, skidding it on its hocks. Dust splattered into the radiator. Dawes felt some sting his cheek. "What's doing, Jim?" Rick jerked through his teeth. "It ain't like you to be out here. Has the bloody bridge dropped down or something?" He tipped back his hat. Dawes scratched his stubbled head. "No," he grunted, "the bridge is all right. It's something a damned sight worse. You can't water the cattle in the river." Rick stared through sun-raw lids. Carved lines bit in his face. "Don't give me that," he said. "You're off your bloody head. A man's got to water 'em. He'll never get 'em over the bridge." Dawes fumbled for his handkerchief, deep-toned by the distance. The bullocks bawled thirstily. Menace roared in the sound. Dawes wiped his sweating neck folds. "Maybe you won't," he nodded, "and then again, maybe you will. I ain't never seen you beat yet. But the way it is, Rick, you've got to keep 'em out of the river. They'll have to wait till tomorrow when you get to Smithson's Bore, the other side of Yorinda." Rick hawked the dust from his throat. "For Christ's sake," he grated, "you don't have to tell me that. I know where Smithson's is, but what I don't know is about the river. For Christ's sake, again, why don't you tell a man?" The sweat glistened on Dawes' face. He stuffed the handkerchief in his pocket. To hell with it, he thought. The way Rick's shapen, a man's got his work cut out, staying clear of trouble. He's keyed up to buggery, and I don't wonder at it. The goddamned country would send a blackfella crazy. He crossed one boot over the other. "Keep your flamin' shirt on," he grunted. "I'm comin' to it now. The stock inspector's been around, and he's declared the river unfit for drinking. She's crawling with bloody maggots. You wouldn't believe it, what the last week has done to her. Since you fellas left, she's dried right up. Just a pothole here and there. The rest just stinkin' slime. If this lot go in it," he jerked a thumb at the herd, "you could kiss 'em all good-bye. Wouldn't even see a bubble." Rick felt his neck skin crawl. He rested his hands on the pommel to keep them from shaking. "Why the hell didn't you say," he said, "instead of beating around like a chook with its neck broke? If that's how she is, there's nothing more to it. A man can't go back, so he's got to go forward." He stared towards the bullocks. "But you see how it is. The bastards are choked with dust, full of sand and dry stalks. It's a sure thing what'll happen once they sniff that bloody water. They're gutted up all right." Dawes shaded his eyes from the sun glare. "And I know what your chances are," he went on. "I wouldn't be with ya for all the tea in China. When a man's got a belly like I've got, he's better out of the road. He's got Buckley's chance of flogging, the way you fellas will have to flog. But I'll do the best I can to get one or two fellas from the town to help ya, if you like." He squinted up at Rick. Rick felt his hand jerk when he rubbed it on his chin. The hell, he thought, a man's shaking like a leaf. Got the bloody jitters crawling in his guts. He'll be better when he gets back to the cattle. Stops this god-forsaken nagging. It's the sitting still that does it. He slid the hand down, setting it firm on top of the other. "No," he grunted, "the blokes I've got'll be enough. A man'll know where they are. You rope in some of them barflies, and they'll do more harm than good. Just leave her as she is. We'll manage." He spat over the pommel. Dawes shrugged away from the mudguard. He had his boot inside the car when he said, "All right, Rick, I'll leave you to it. How about Molly? You want her out just the same." He squeezed in behind the wheel and slammed the door. "You can tell her what the strife is," Rick said. "Tell her, too, that the cows be handy, but it ain't too safe. If the bullocks go and someone gets tangled in 'em, what's left ain't gonna be pretty." His horse fidgeted as he gathered the reins. "I'll do that," Dawes nodded, "but it won't make much difference. She'll be out there just the same. How about Two Fingers? I'll be passing him on the way in. Anything fresh you want me to tell him?" The motor coughed under the bonnet. Dawes revved it with the pedal. "Yeah," Rick said, reining close to the car door. "Tell 'em we won't be watering 'em, and to meet us as quick as he can. Never mind the horses. He can slam 'em straight into the yards. So long, Jim. I'll be seeing ya." "Yeah," Dawes nodded. "So long, Rick. Keep your legs tight on the leather." "I'll do that," Rick grunted, "or split me bloody crutch." "So long." He spurred his horse sideways as the car spewed dust. Dawes' hand waved from the window.